I got the most outrageous gift of my life on the morning of my 65th birthday. My son, whom I had raised and sacrificed for over the years, looked me in the eye and said, "You should move into a retirement home and leave the house and the money to me." I didn't argue or cry. I just smiled as I entered the most opulent senior living facility in the city and signed the admission paperwork. That same day, I finalized a trust to cut him off completely, removing all access to my assets and leaving him impoverished. His world fell apart overnight, but for me, my real life started the moment I shut the door behind me. I never thought I'd spend my 65th birthday like this. All I wanted was a peaceful dinner in the kitchen, so I made my famous chicken and rice, casserole with creamy mushroom soup and a crisp Caesar salad. The air was filled with the comforting aroma of home cooking, and the dining table was already set, with silverware and polished candles in their holders, waiting for my son to return home. He hadn't been in this house for a full year, and since he was a young child, he would hide by the kitchen door on my birthday. He would whisper, his eyes shining with pride, "Happy birthday, Mommy," while holding wildflowers in his tiny hands, peeking around the corner. But now I couldn't remember the last time he called me Mom. I looked at the clock on the living room wall at 7:30 p.m. He had promised a surprise tonight, but so far, there was not even a hint of his presence. I lit the candles, blew them out, lit them again, and finally gave up because it was 8:30. When the front door finally creaked open, I was shocked to see Colin stumble in, reeking of alcohol, a lazy smirk stretching across his face, and before I could say anything, a woman in gaudy clothes, her makeup heavy, one hand balancing an oversized handbag, the other resting on a visibly pregnant belly, followed him in. Colin said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "This is Tessa, my new fiancée. She's 6 months along. I stood frozen, so we thought it would be a good time for you to move back in for a while." I didn't move, and my fingers tightened around the hem of my dress. Colin continued with a shrug, as if we were talking about the weather. "If you're not up for it, there's always the nursing home. Those nice ones don't come cheap, and I hate wasting money. I mean, those nice ones don't come cheap." So his voice held no warmth, no concern, just a veiled threat wrapped in cold. "You're retired anyway, so you might as well make yourself useful. You've already chosen a low-cost nursing home if I don't comply." I laughed indifferently, almost weightlessly. "So the real surprise was that you offered me a job as your babysitter." He blinked, not expecting such a direct response. "Come on, Mom, don't be like that. You always say that family comes first. So now your family needs you." I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and went upstairs without saying anything else. It was obvious that he hadn't been away for a year because he was busy. I stayed away because I was only helpful when necessary. The meal I had painstakingly prepared sat untouched on the table, going cold, just like the last thread of warmth I felt for this house. That night, I sat by my bedroom window and called Skyview Estate, the best senior living facility in the Sao City. "Good evening. Thank you for calling Skyview. How may we help you? I'd like to reserve a premium independent living suite," I said calmly. "For 20 years, paid in full, ma'am. Are you sure that's a significant amount?" "I'm sure. Additionally, would you like to designate any family members as your emergency contact?" I paused, said softly, "No family." And there was silence. The other person understood, and I said, "Thank you, and have your private relocation and wellness team at your residence in 5 days." I ended the call and let my gaze wander to the vanity across the room, where 2 old photos were sitting. One was of Richard and me in the early days of our research careers, lab coats and bright hopes, and the other was of a laughing baby, Colin cradled in my arms. I reached out and turned. The second one faced down, and a quiet chill settled in my chest. Perhaps I believed that at 65 I owed no one my... "This kitchen is so outdated," Tessa complained, tapping the tiled countertop with her manicured fingernail, as if she were touching a moldy carpet. "No steam oven, no air fryer. How am I supposed to make healthy food for the baby in here?" I felt genuinely relieved that night for the first time in my life. The following morning, as soon as I came downstairs, I heard the clatter of dishes in the kitchen and Tessa's grating voice echoing off the walls. "Morning, Mom. Mind fixing us some breakfast?" he said, slouched at the dining table, scrolling idly through his phone without even looking up. I said in a flat voice. I stared at the untouched casserole from the previous night, still sitting on the counter, as if it were nothing more than leftover scraps. You didn't even touch the food I made yesterday. Colin shrugged guiltlessly, and Tessa said it smelled too strong because her nose is extremely sensitive during pregnancy. Tessa immediately added, "Yeah, the whole house reeked of that greasy smell. It made me want to throw up, honestly. Ordering in would have been easier," I said quietly. "You two staying here is temporary," I said at last, my voice calm. Too calm, like the still air before a summer storm. This house isn't a hotel, and it's not a maternity retreat. Colin scowled and said, "This house isn't a hotel, and it's not a maternity retreat." I had gathered the cold dishes, ready to throw them out, but something stopped me as I opened the trash can. My mushroom soup, which I had simmered for 2 hours, was poured straight into the garbage, keeping the spoon in the bowl. I said, looking him in the eye, not mine, "I'm 65. I'm not your nanny maid or backup plan. You didn't used to be like this." Colin snapped his voice, rising. "You used to love me. What happened to you? How did you get so cold? You want to talk about cold showing up on your mother's birthday with a pregnant stranger treating her like a living servant and threatening to put her in a nursing home when she says no." When she says no, his mouth twitches, but nothing comes out. Tessa broke the silence, saying, "Colin, don't argue with her. If she doesn't want to help, we can just hire someone. There's no need to stay here and be treated like this." Her voice was dripping with implication. "Did you mention that your mom still had some savings? We're short on money for the investment. Remember, if she truly cares about you, wouldn't she want to help?" And all I could see was the unbridled greed behind her practiced smile, which made my stomach turn. "That's what this is really about," I said quietly. "You're not here for me. You're here for my money," Colin said. "Don't say that about Tessa." "If you do have money, what's so wrong with helping your only son well?" I said in a voice like ice. "You two need to leave. This home doesn't welcome you anymore." In a moment, Colin leaped to his feet. "Are you serious right now?" "You're kicking us out." I looked at his face indignantly. Incredulous, he shook his head and said, "Do I not have that right? You're old, and I'm your only son. Who do you think is going to take care of you when you're too frail to walk? Do you think that money will keep you company?" Tessa, emboldened by his outburst, added sarcastically, "Exactly. If anyone is leaving, it should be you, Colin, and I'm not going anywhere. And don't even consider taking the money, or the last hope I had for my son, burned out like a dying candle." And I knew that this time I wasn't going back, that I would no longer live my life for anyone else but myself. I didn't respond. I just looked at them both calm and silent, a bitter laugh forming inside me. They had completely forgotten who this house truly belonged to. 2 days went by, and the house no longer felt like mine thanks to Tessa. Took over the living room, decorating a baby corner with pink streamers, cartoon pillows, and glittering balloon letters. It appeared as though she was attempting to transform the entire house into her private nursery. There wasn't even a peaceful area left where I could sit and sip coffee. The kitchen had also been transformed into her domain, and she rearranged the cabinets to fit her system, throwing my meticulously labeled pillboxes, tea canisters, and recipe binders into the storage closet like clutter. Meanwhile, Colin spent most of his time in the study, pacing through endless phone calls, his voice tight with stress, and from what I could tell, his so-called new venture wasn't going more than when I heard him complaining to whoever was on the other end about cash flow. Neither of them brought up my birthday again as if it had never happened. I assumed I was ready and didn't want to be surprised, but some things still managed to surprise me. That afternoon, after I had finished pruning roses in the garden, I went into the kitchen to find Tessa packing my set of fine bone china into a cardboard box. "This stuff is so dated," she muttered with a wrinkled nose. "I'm getting a more modern set." "Colin said you wouldn't mind that set belonged to my mother," I said quietly. Standing in the doorway, she looked back. She was irritated. Well, she's gone, isn't she? You can't live in the past forever. This is my home, I said firmly. Not yours, and it's not up to you, she scoffed, biting her lip before snapping. You sure act like this place is yours, but let's be honest, won't it all belong to Colin soon anyway? I smiled, then calmly unshaken. You're really that sure Colin's still getting this house that gave her pause? But she turned away after a moment. Without saying a word, I left the boxes behind, the bone china half-packed and thrown out like trash, and carefully started putting the dishes back into the cabinet one at a time. It felt like a small act of defiance, a way to hold on a little while longer, but I knew I couldn't do this alone. That evening, I called a number I hadn't called in a long time, and a warm, familiar voice answered. It was Martha, the woman who had assisted me in running this household for years, and Colin had fired her last year without letting me know, saying there was no need to keep an old maid on payroll for a house with only one occupant. It's me, Martha, I said quietly. Then there was a moment of shock, followed by a flood of emotion. Ma'am, thank God, I've been praying every day that you're okay. I kept wondering if I should just show up on your doorstep. I'm okay, I said, throat tight. But I need you to come. Back? She arrived that very afternoon, just like every other time, and she rushed through the door, shrugged off her coat, and went straight for the kitchen. What in the world are takeout containers doing in the fridge, ma'am? How have you, been eating this garbage? I can still cook, she said, smiling wearily. But the kitchen doesn't belong to me anymore. That girl, I agreed. I always said the young master had poor judgment, Martha mumbled. But this one takes the cake, she remarked. She's just like all the others except worse, and now she's bullying even you. Oh no, it is unacceptable. As Tessa came downstairs, she paused upon seeing Martha, her face contorted in, I was hired by the lady of the house. Not you, Tessa. I scoffed, waddled to the couch, and plopped down without saying anything, but the animosity in her eyes was evident. For dinner, Martha prepared my favorite beef stew and vegetable soup, which I ate slowly, each bite feeling like I was piecing together pieces of myself that had begun to fall apart. When Colin got home, the smell of the food hit him right away. He sniffed the air and smiled. This evening smells good. Still holding the pot, Martha came out of the kitchen and said, Sir, this was your favorite when you were a boy. Do you recall? Colin's face became rigid with pain as his smile wavered. What are you doing here? Didn't I tell you you were retired? He asked, frowning. Colin sighed and rubbed his temples. I brought her back, I said evenly. Mom, he said, you're being stubborn again. I know you don't like Tessa, but she's carrying your grandchild. Can't you try to be a little more understanding? I laughed softly. You think I brought Martha back because I don't like Tessa? I pointed to the dining table. This is a home, not a rental home, I said calmly. Don't get to erase everything that made this place mine, Mom. Do you even hear yourself? You're ruining our chance to be a real family if this is what you call a family. Colin slammed his fork down on the table, rattling the dishes with a loud clatter, and then he leaped to his feet, shouting, Okay, go ahead and be your little lonely queen, but don't come crawling when you're old and helpless and nobody's around to care for you. It was better to live than to endure his glare. I knew that something had changed between us permanently when I finished my second cup of coffee at the dining table. The sky outside the kitchen window was still dark, and as I finished my second cup of coffee, Martha moved silently through the kitchen, making breakfast. She didn't ask many questions, and she never needed to look into my eyes. I no longer hoped for him to understand me, and I no longer believed that he would change. I looked over the heavy pile of papers next to me, and then she said softly, Ma'am, are you sure about this? I gave a slight nod and carefully closed the folder. This wasn't a fleeting emotion. Rather, it was a long-term decision. For years, Colin's cruelty and defiance had pierced me like tiny blades, but I kept defending him, telling myself that he was simply lost, and that he would change his mind after all I had put into raising him. The place I had previously called home was no longer mine, and I could finally confess it. Skyview's transition team is arriving at 10 tomorrow morning, I added quietly, and I want everything to go smoothly. Martha froze at the stove, her eyes sparkling. You've spent the majority of your life in this house, so it's time to say goodbye, I said. She nodded silently and went back to organizing my at 9. Colin shuffled into the living room with a wink and shadows pulled under his eyes. He carried Tessa's insulated flask, which looked like it was made of lead, and he waved lazily at Martha, saying, "Can you make an egg sandwich or something? Tessa only wants your cooking now that she didn't seem to like this kitchen 2 days ago." Martha said, "Can you make an egg sandwich or something?" Colin frowned but didn't answer, so he sank onto the sofa and turned on the television. I watched him, the man who used to crawl into my lap as a boy and beg me to read him bedtime stories now. Colin, who is more like a stranger renting space in my house, and I need to talk. I said softly, "Can it wait?" And he muttered, "Can it wait?" I sat down and said, "Finer this time." He finally turned off the TV and looked very irritated. "Are you still mad, Mom?" I told him that Tessa is straightforward and says things as they are, but that's not what this is about. I took one document out of the folder and placed it on the table in front of him. "This is my residential plan for Skyview Estate, and I'm moving in tomorrow morning." At first, Colin didn't react. Flipping through a few pages informally, his expression changed when he saw phrases like long-term occupancy, 24-hour concierge service, and advanced medical care. He was silent for a moment before forcing a laugh, saying, "Maybe a retirement community isn't the worst idea. Go clear your head for a bit. If you get bored, I can always find you another place." I looked at him steadily before saying, "I'm not coming back." His smile froze in mid-expression. "I'll be transferring ownership of this house to Martha and a few close friends who have supported me over the years. I am your son, but you have never treated me like your mother. The moment you returned with Tessa demanding the house and my savings as if they were your birthright, you ceased to be my son. You are just a man who uses blood ties to manipulate affection." His face flushed red, and his fingers trembled with rage. "I knew something was wrong with you lately, and you've been doing all of this behind my back." I unfolded a second document and spread it across the coffee table. "It is the trust one signed this morning. All of my assets will be used to support my care and medical needs at Skyview, and the remainder will be allocated to a foundation for young artists supporting their education and exhibitions." His eyes scanned the page, getting wider by the second. "Fine. Keep the house, but don't tell me you're planning to throw all your money away too," he said, spitting a curse under his breath. "That stupid fund is a reflection of what matters to me now," I responded evenly, adding that it would be preferable for someone who is pursuing their dreams to receive the money than for someone only interested in taking it. "You've gone crazy," he said with a sour chuckle. "Because who the hell creates a charity fund at your age?" Yes, I looked him in the eye without flinching because when the doorbell rang, Martha opened it to reveal Skyview's transition team. 3 professionals in fitted suits, calm and courteous, carrying clipboards, a moving checklist, and medical intake forms. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," one of them said with a polite smile. "We're here to walk you through your final onboarding before your move tomorrow." Colin Pauld said, red in the face as he realized this wasn't a threat. Temporarily, this was real and I was leaving Mom. His voice cracked. "You're going through with this. You're handing this house over to strangers and just walking away from me." I collected the paperwork back into its folder and stood there, quietly saying, "I'm not the one walking away, Colin." I said, "You shut the door on me a long time ago, and from now on, my life will be my own, and you will never again decide what I do with it." The morning at Skyview was calm and bright, and I sat in a wicker chair on the balcony while sipping a warm cup of rose tea. It smelled of something I hadn't breathed in years. There were no agitated voices, hungry stares, or people requesting anything from me. The Skyview team handled everything with ease. The dietitian created my meal plans. The nurses recorded my health information daily, and my calendar was packed with gardening classes, flower workshops, and art salons. It felt like every part of my long-forgotten spirit was gradually reviving. For the first time in decades, I didn't have to tread carefully around other people's needs or moods. My time was all mine. Martha informed me over a video call that everything at the old house was going well. Officially belonged to her and a few loyal friends who had worked for years. But I had no plans to return there, so that afternoon, I started unpacking some of my older stuff. When I had moved into Skyview, I had asked the concierge staff to bring a private trunk that I hadn't opened in years. Inside, buried beneath layers of velvet, was a heavy wooden frame that I had almost forgotten about. I lifted the cloth, and there it was. Her signature, still perfectly intact, in the lower right corner. Emily Harrington, who had been my best friend in college, gave me this painting as her final gift after graduation. She named the painting Orchids at Dusk and sent it to me with a handwritten note saying, "I know how much you love orchids and tea. The evening light. I hope you'll always remember the dreams we once shared." I had kept it sealed away in my study for all those years, not because it was worth much on the market, but because it meant too much. Now, resting in the sunlit living room of Skyview, the painting seemed to take on new meaning. I was no longer the woman who ran a household who lived in service to. I had no idea that painting would be the beginning of a new journey until this morning, when the front desk at Skyview handed me an envelope with an invitation from the city's Museum of Art to an exhibition of Emily's final works with the theme Women and Nature. 3 months ago, I donated several of Emily's paintings. As I stared at the painting, a quiet thought took root. Perhaps it was time to share these things I'd hidden for so long. Perhaps I could do something real for young artists like Emily once was. While I was organizing the exhibition papers, Skyview's media coordinator published a full-page spread about Eleanor Whitmore donating Emily Harrington's final works. A monumental gift to American women's art. Late-period pieces for the museum, Orchids at Dusk, had been included in an art review quarterly called It's a Rare and Radiant Allergy to Life. Those canvases had sat in my study for decades, too personal to show, too precious to share. But now I was ready. Showed up at my door with a video call request from Martha, which I accepted. She was standing at the old house's front gate, her face unreadable, and she said, "Your donations made the headlines." I laughed. Isn't he still busy trying to replace the living room couch with some expensive Italian piece? Martha sighed. It's not the art. He told me today those paintings should have been family heirlooms, she said, pausing. Then he asked if you had anything else valuable stashed away. I nodded slowly, so he's finally afraid. She gave me a wry smile, but it got even more interesting when a bank employee arrived. He had applied for a personal loan, but it was denied, and his accounts had been frozen. When he tried to offer up the house as collateral, he discovered that official titles were already in our name. I smiled faintly, realizing that the last piece of the puzzle was in place. "Ma'am, you're not leaving anything behind for him," I said evenly. I didn't touch his money. The rest was always up to him. Of course, Martha's tone sharpened. My son, the boy I once centered my life around, was just learning what loss truly felt like. Only now did he realize he no longer had me, and he had no more power over me. But this was only the beginning. Outside the window, a gardener was trimming roses, and a group of residents were gathered by the gazebo, sharing tips about flower arranging. 2 young women were practicing violin near the fountain, their notes floating into the air like something sacred. Somewhere beyond that peaceful world, I ended the call and turned back toward the window. The streets were still covered in neon, rain and shadow from earlier in the evening, which reflected the blur of headlights and storefront signs. Colin was standing beneath the buzzing glow of a bar sign, leaning against the doorway as if he had lost the strength to stay upright. The cigarette in his fingers had long since burned out, but he didn't flick the ash. He didn't even seem to notice it. His face was hollowed out from exhaustion, with dark circles under his eyes, and the faint odor of smoke and stale whiskey clung to his unshaven jaw. I had stopped keeping track of Colin's life long ago, but no matter how far I moved away, his name continued to appear in the news. In the past month, he had tried everything. Begged friends for loans, pitched his half-baked business ideas to any investor who would listen, and even made weak attempts to contact me in the hopes that I would change my mind. Since then, no one was buying what he was selling, and I had severed every financial tie he had previously relied on. The house had been moved, the accounts frozen. He no longer had access to any sub-accounts under my name. All of his credit card, auto payments had been stopped. His loan applications were rejected. His calls went unanswered. And even Tess had thought she was marrying into luxury, picturing a life of ease and a well-groomed heir, the kind of man whose mother would always keep the money flowing. However, she was watching that fantasy rot in real time as Colin slipped from being an entitled trust fund prince to a man with mounting debts and no one left to fool. That afternoon, after finishing a gardening workshop, I sat on my balcony looking through foundation proposals. One proposal caught my attention. An arts high school in Boston had already submitted a proposal to create a studio in memory of Emily Harrington that would foster young artists from low-income families. I immediately approved the grant and attached it to a freshly printed letterhead from the foundation. The gesture and the goal were far more meaningful to me than ever giving Colin a check. Shortly before dinner, Martha's video call arrived. She stood outside the old house with her face drawn and serious. "Ma'am, I need to update you," she said in a low voice. "Collins is not doing well," she said, and I just nodded, allowing her to continue. "He's been seen at a few casinos and has already accrued a substantial amount of debt, but none of his former buddies will answer his phone." I silently put down my teacup, not astonished that he had already started the process of losing everything when he decided to use a mother's love as leverage. "Someone had seen him at a VIP club the other night," Martha went on, "and he lost big, trying to use the house as leverage. Collateral, only to discover too late that the deed was no longer in his name." I closed my eyes and took a deep, slow breath, thinking, "I've done enough." I said quietly, "If he still can't see what's broken, then no one can save him." There was a pause, and Martha asked gently, "Do you plan to see him again?" I knew that day would arrive, so I chose not to respond, and instead looked out onto the lake's quiet water beyond the balcony. The day he showed up at Skyview's front gate, I was working on the Foundation's annual report when a nurse gently knocked as I was editing a section of the document. Mrs. Whitmore murmured, "There's a man at the front desk. He says he's your family." I put down my pen without hastily answering, instead asking, "What does he look like?" Then silently, the nurse paused. "He appears worn out and a little rough," I said. I nodded, got up and put on my coat as I made my way to the entrance. I could see him standing off to the side of the garden path, close to the hydrangeas that were just starting to bloom. He appeared to be a shell of the person he had once tried so hard to be. His clothes were wrinkled and stained, his hair was disheveled, and his face was obscured by patchy stubble. The pride that had once shone in his eyes had vanished, and we briefly met eyes. His first words weren't "hello" or "I came to see you," but rather, "You won." I watched the man who used to be my son, Colin, at the top of the stairs. He was a boy who had finally run out of ways to get away, so I said quietly, "This was never a competition, and I never needed to win against you. He smiled bitterly. I have nothing left. Even Tessa is gone. I nodded, but it didn't stir. What do you want from me? I asked. He opened his mouth, searching for words, and then he dropped his gaze. Really messed up. And I sighed that I felt emptier than the ones he used to mumble as a child, crying over a broken vase, because this time I knew he wasn't sorry. He was stranded, and I didn't even have a place to stay. He said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "Are you just going to leave me like this?" I stood silent for a long time, telling Colin that I wasn't abandoning him but letting him take responsibility for himself. He looked up, and I couldn't tell if his eyes flickered with anger or grief. Who sacrificed everything for you, including my dignity? But that woman no longer lives here. You can call it cold or cruel, but know that you brought us here. I turned and walked back inside, and the door closed softly behind me. I could feel him standing there on the other side. But as I lay in bed that night, the lake lapped gently against the shore outside my window, and I thought of him as a baby, curling up in my arms and trying to form words. I thought that if I loved him enough, he would grow into a kind, responsible man, but I was mistaken. From learning to be independent, I had let go, and he had a long road ahead. As for me, I still had a lot to do, a lot of people to support, and a lot of chapters of life left to write. I never imagined that I would be starting over at this point in my life, but that's the way life is, isn't it? The chapters that truly belong to you often don't start until you've persuaded yourself that the story is already over. The springtime at Skyview is lovely, with the tulips in the garden just starting to poke through the dirt and the lawn carpeted, with patches of violets that look like dreams. Since its inception, the Emily Harrington Art Foundation has supported 12 young artists, 2 of whom are currently getting ready for their first solo exhibitions. We have partnered with several local high schools to offer free art classes and materials for children from low-income families. People frequently ask me, "Mrs. Whitmore, what inspired you to devote your later years to arts education?" As I sit on the balcony with the most recent grant list from the foundation resting in my lap, every time I remark, "I only decided to contribute what would have wealth that has been squandered by those who use it to make something useful." The truth is, though, that every effort, grant, and student support has been a gift to me. It's my way of saying that I still have worth, purpose, and the ability to create something significant. That evening, I received an invitation to attend a small exhibition organized by the foundation at Skyview's multi-purpose hall, which was converted into a classy and comfortable gallery. A group of students stood proudly next to their artwork, laughing and chatting. A girl named Nora, who was full of hope, timidly approached me. She was holding a minimalist watercolor painting of a lone woman standing by a lake with a solitary orchid in full bloom next to her. "I painted this for you," she said quietly. "I heard you love orchids." Her eyes widened as I responded, "Thank you, Nora," and held the artwork in my hands. "You know, this looks a lot like me." Actually, I nodded and said, "But now I'm not the woman standing by herself at the lake's edge anymore. I've entered my own life." After the exhibit, I stood by the window overlooking the floor and watched the moonlight dance across the lake surface. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear children laughing, and in the adjacent room, the senior choir was practicing soft harmonies that drifted in and out like a lullaby. Life was peaceful now, but later that evening, Martha sent me a message, saying that the old house's community garden had finally been cleaned up. She included a picture of old friends laughing over pots and pans in the kitchen, fresh herbs, and roses blooming in the yard. It looked more vibrant than it had when I lived there. I replied, "Take good care of that home. Think of it as your second chapter." She replied, "You didn't just give us a house, you gave us dignity." I stared at the picture. After a long moment of eyes misting, I realized that what I had thought I had lost had been transformed. A few days later, a handwritten letter from Colin arrived. The writing was shaky and uneven, but I recognized it right away. He said he had finally read the last letter I had left for him, and that he now truly understood how deeply he had failed. He revealed that he had moved into a low-income apartment in the suburbs, taken a job as a warehouse clerk, and begun trying to stop gambling. He said he knew this was the life he had earned and that he didn't expect forgiveness, but that perhaps one day he would be able to stand before me, not to ask for anything, but just to be seen again, honestly, as a changed man. I didn't write back, but I put the letter in my drawer next to Emily's painting. Maybe I'll forgive him someday, but not today. Not because I'm still angry, but because I've finally learned to put myself first. This morning, as I walked alone, along the Skyview garden path, the sun rose softly and goldenly. The breeze was warm, and I felt lighter in some way, as if a piece of me had finally let go. I knew my story wasn't over. Perhaps I had spent the first half of my life living for other people's approval, compromising to not take up too much room, but the rest of it would belong to me regardless of my steps. I used to think I had it all: money, time, and a future, paved with ease, but it wasn't until I lost everything that I realized life doesn't come with a reset button. My name is Colin Whitmore, and once people called me the Golden Boy, wealthy, sharp, well-connected, and destined for success. Now I'm just a man with nothing to my name. I want to tell you that I will never again be pulled down by anyone, and that my heart will never again shrink to fit into someone else's world. Not to defend myself or solicit sympathy, but to try and make sense of it all, to break it down piece by piece and understand how I managed to ruin a winning hand so completely. Lately, I've been dreaming about my childhood, when everything was good and nothing was perfect. My mom would hum that old song while baking apple pie in the kitchen, the scent wafting through the air like a promise outside the window, where her rose bushes bloomed in soft clusters, and I would sit on a small stool, waiting for the first slice to cool, asking her, "Mom, will you always stay with me?" She would smile in response, nod each time I say, "Of course, sweetheart." Her delicate hands could transform plain white paper into miniature works of art for my school projects. My father was a kind, bookish man who loved to read poetry on the couch. He worked late most nights, but he always took me fishing by the lake on the weekends. "Boys need to learn patience, Colin," he would say. "If you can wait for the fish, you can wait for life." They loved me deeply, and I loved them back with all the force of a child's heart. He didn't say much, but there was always something steady and warm in his eyes. When I got a cold or a fever, Mom would stay up all night by my side. On my birthday. Dad never brought toys. Instead, he gave me books. He used to say, "What a man should be proud of is his mind, not his wallet." Back then, love felt unstoppable and instinctive, and I had no idea what it would be like to lose it. Dad's death came as a shock, and I didn't understand those words. I remember that night when Mom was holding me and crying like a child, and I cried too, but what I felt was fear that the roof above us had cracked and that we had no one left to support it. Nevertheless, Mom didn't collapse. Instead, she took charge of Dad's affairs, reorganized the family trust, and took care of every little detail with her own two hands. I grew accustomed to being taken care of, and I truly respected her, but somehow that respect turned into something else. She provided me with everything I could want, including clothes, toys, tuition, and opportunities. I never once had to go without excellent things. I first got a taste of the circle in high school, when kids like me were rich, entitled, and untouchable. Their dads owned half the city in real estate, and their moms ran art galleries and threw fundraisers like fashion shows. After school, they would drive away in sports cars, hit the beach with champagne, and talk big about venture capital and connections as if the world already belonged to them. And what did I give her in return? What was a son who came home less and less? A voice that grew colder with each visit. And disappointment after disappointment stacked like unpaid debts. I didn't know why, but something inside me suddenly became aware that status is the only thing that counts, so I changed. I began to despise the simple yet elegant shirts my mother had chosen for me, and I begged her for expensive designer brands, with loud logos and meaningless prestige. I also stopped eating at home and instead started eating ribeye steaks at trendy restaurants and expensive wine that I couldn't pronounce. I had friends who valued wristwatches and bottle service and took me to nightclubs, private poker rooms, and upscale boutiques, and I spent a lot of money. I felt like the heir, indestructible, and wanted to be like someone significant. My mother became the one person I couldn't bear to see. She would inquire, "What VA have you been working on lately?" I would dismiss it with a projects. She'd reply, "You're overspending." She would say, "You must take it." And I would sneer, "What's money for if not to spend?" Accountability to oneself. The more she tried to reach me, the more I resisted. She didn't understand that I was trying to fit in with a society where money was important, so I started to view her as a barrier rather than my mother. The more she chastised my way of life, the more extravagantly I flaunted it. It wasn't that I didn't know I was disappointing her. I just told myself she was resentful that I resented her. I stopped going home because of her tight-fisted, old-fashioned control, and when I did, I only said, "I need some startup cash. I have this investment opportunity. This is the groundwork for our future." My friends echoed this lie, saying she simply doesn't want you to surpass her. They said she's jealous. She tried to reason with me at first, but then she simply fell silent. Eventually, she stopped having a place at the table for me, but I didn't mind since I believed she was finally learning. But she never gave up. She continued to send me money each month and had Martha bring me medicine when I was ill. I never thanked her once I almost fell victim to an illegal investment scheme. She found me a lawyer who cleaned up the mess behind the scenes, and I stormed home and yelled at her for meddling in my affairs. She just looked at me, exhausted and silent, and I said, "I just want to help you avoid the worst mistakes." Looking back, that may have been the most cruel thing I have ever said to her, but the worst happened later, when she turned 60. I thought, I had it all planned. We would present Tessa and the baby as a surprise, say we wanted to keep the family together, and then ask her to move in and help with postpartum care once she was softened up with the real request for financial support, just until we were on our feet. However, to make a move, I brought Tessa, who was pregnant, because we needed money, and I thought her pregnancy would make a perfect bargaining chip. Mom had that huge house all to herself, the family trust, and the foundation funds were all sitting there untouched. "So the big surprise is you want me to be your nanny?" she asked, spotting my slyness in an instant. When I first felt the ground shift beneath me, I knew she was no longer going to play her part. I panicked, but I pretended I was still in control. She didn't scream or fight. Instead, she simply vanished without any drama or confrontation. She signed her name on the Skyview agreement, established a trust, and moved the deed to the house cut. I was used to her waiting in place, to her forgiving me without question, to her remaining soft no matter how hard I pushed, and I thought she would always be that woman who patted my head even after I broke her favorite porcelain cup and whispered, "It's all right." On the day she handed me the Skyview residency paperwork, my first reaction wasn't shock but anger because she dared to leave without my consent. "Please don't cry, my love." But this time she turned around, and when she left, she took everything. With her, the money, the house, the identity I'd borrowed like a costume, and even the love I used to pretend I didn't need. She took that too. I went to my friends asking for loans. They said, "Colin, that guy's little trick stopped working years ago." "Sorry, your linked accounts," the bank responded when I applied for credit. "Been turned off." I discovered that I no longer owned the house when I attempted to use it as collateral. Tessa also abruptly left without saying anything, leaving me with nothing left to use as leverage. I persuaded myself that my partner had no justification for me to return to my mother again. Even though I could get everything back in a single night or two, I kept losing, and every time I placed a wager, I lost a little more of myself. I had forgotten my identity by the time I was outside Skyview's gates, but then I noticed her coming out of the eye responded, "You win," as if she were a part of the soft, clear-eyed sunshine. This was not a contest, he remarked. I told her I was mistaken, and she gave me a look before asking, and I realized then that she wasn't punishing me. Rather, she was at last choosing herself. I returned home that evening, if you can call it that, to the small apartment I had recently moved into. So, with my hands shaking, I sat at my used desk and wrote her a letter. I told her that I wasn't sure if she would ever forgive me because I was attempting to start over and had found a job in a warehouse, but that she was the first one who had ever loved me without expecting anything in return, and I finally realized that I'm not sure whether she will ever reply, and I don't expect her to, but I folded the letter carefully and sent it nevertheless. Because in actuality, I still have a lot of work ahead of me. I have bills to pay, mistakes to make, and ruins to undo. She gave me everything, her kindness, patience, and strength, and I now have to recreate it piece by piece. I crushed it all under the weight of my pride because she was my home, not my ATM or safety net. I believed she would never leave, but she did, and I just realized that she had already given me everything. Now it's my turn to use the remaining time in this life to develop into the kind of guy who might one day deserve the love I once pursued. Granted.